Chapters 45 and 46 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 45. I have already had reason to say that Isabel knew her husband to be displeased by the continuance of Ralph's visit to Rome. That knowledge was very present to her as she went to her cousin's hotel the day after she had invited Lord Warburton to give a tangible proof of his sincerity, and at this moment, as at others, she had a sufficient perception of the sources of Osmond's opposition. He wished her to have no freedom of mind, and he knew perfectly well that Ralph was an apostle of freedom. It was just because he was this, Isabel said to herself, that it was a refreshment to go and see him. It will be perceived that she partook of this refreshment in spite of her husband's aversion to it, that is, partook of it, as she flattered herself, discreetly. She had not as yet undertaken to act in direct opposition to his wishes. He was her appointed and inscribed master. She waited at moments with a sort of incredulous blankness at this fact. It weighed upon her imagination, however. Constantly present to her mind were all the traditionary decencies and sanctities of marriage. The idea of violating them filled her with shame as well as with dread, for on giving herself away she had lost sight of this contingency in the perfect belief that her husband's intentions were as generous as her own. She seemed to see, none the less, the rapid approach of the day when she should have to take back something she had solemnly bestowed. Such a ceremony would be odious and monstrous. She tried to shut her eyes to it meanwhile. Osmond would do nothing to help it by beginning first. He would put that burden upon her to the end. He had not yet formally forbidden her to call upon Ralph, but she felt sure that unless Ralph should very soon depart, this prohibition would come. How could poor Ralph depart? The weather as yet made it impossible. She could perfectly understand her husband's wish for the event. She didn't, to be just, see how he could like her to be with her cousin. Ralph never said a word against him, but Osmond's sore, mute protest was none the less founded. If he should positively interpose, if he should put forth his authority, she would have to decide, and that wouldn't be easy. The prospect made her heart beat and her cheeks burn, as I say in advance. There were moments when, in her wish to avoid an open rupture, she found herself wishing Ralph would start even at a risk. And it was of no use that, when catching herself in this state of mind, she called herself a feeble spirit, a coward. It was not that she loved Ralph less, but that almost anything seemed preferable to repudiating the most serious act, the single sacred act of her life. That appeared to make the whole future hideous. To break with Osmond once would be to break for ever. Any open acknowledgment of irreconcilable needs would be an admission that their whole attempt had proved a failure. For them there could be no condonement, no compromise, no easy forgetfulness, no formal readjustment. They had attempted only one thing, but that one thing was to have been exquisite. Once they missed it, nothing else would do. There was no conceivable substitute for that success. For the moment Isabel went to the Hôtel de Paris as often as she thought well. The measure of propriety was in the canon of taste, and there couldn't have been a better proof that morality was, so to speak, a matter of earnest appreciation. Isabel's application of that measure had been particularly free to-day, for in addition to the general truth that she couldn't leave Ralph to die alone, she had something important to ask of him. This indeed was Gilbert's business as well as her own. She came very soon to what she wished to speak of. "I want you to answer me a question. It's about Lord Warburton." "I think I guess your question," Ralph answered from his armchair, out of which his thin legs protruded at a greater length than ever. "Very possibly you can guess it. Please then answer it." "Oh, I don't say I can do that." "You're intimate with him," she said. "You've a great deal of observation of him." "Very true. But think how he must dissimulate." Why should he dissimulate? That's not his nature." "Ah, you must remember that the circumstances are peculiar," said Ralph, with an air of private amusement. "To a certain extent, yes. But is he really in love?" "Very much, I think. I can make that out." "Ah," said Isabel, with a certain dryness. Ralph looked at her as if his mild hilarity had been touched with mystification. "You say that as if you were disappointed." Isabel got up, slowly smoothing her gloves and eyeing them thoughtfully. "It's, after all, no business of mine." "You're very philosophic," said her cousin. And then, in a moment, "May I inquire what you're talking about?" Isabel stared. "I thought you knew. Lord Warburton tells me he wants, of all things in the world, to marry Pansy. I've told you that before, without eliciting a comment from you. You might risk one this morning, I think. Is it your belief that he really cares for her?" "Ah, for Pansy, no!" cried Ralph, very positively. "But you said just now he did." Ralph waited a moment. "That he cared for you, Mrs. Osmond." Isabel shook her head gravely. "That's nonsense, you know." "Of course it is. But the nonsense is Warburton's, not mine." "That would be very tiresome." She spoke, as she flattered herself, with much subtlety. "I ought to tell you indeed," Ralph went on, "that to me he has denied it." "It's very good of you to talk about it together. Has he also told you that he's in love with Pansy?" "He has spoken very well of her, very properly. He has let me know, of course, that he thinks she would do very well at Lockleigh." "Does he really think it?" "Ah, what Warburton really thinks," said Ralph. Isabel fell to smoothing her gloves again. They were long, loose gloves, on which she could freely expend herself. Soon, however, she looked up, and then, "Ah, Ralph, you give me no help!" she cried abruptly and passionately. It was the first time she had alluded to the need for help, and the words shook her cousin with their violence. He gave a long murmur of relief, of pity, of tenderness. It seemed to him that at last the gulf between them had been bridged. It was this that made him exclaim in a moment, "How unhappy you must be!" He had no sooner spoken than she recovered her self-possession, and the first use she made of it was to pretend she had not heard him. "When I talk of your helping me, I talk great nonsense," she said, with a quick smile. "The idea of my troubling you with my domestic embarrassments! The matter's very simple. Lord Warburton must get on by himself. I can't undertake to see him through." "He ought to succeed easily," said Ralph. Isabel debated. "Yes, but he has not always succeeded." "Very true. You know, however, how that always surprised me. Is Miss Osmond capable of giving us a surprise?" "It will come from him, rather. I seem to see that after all he'll let the matter drop." "He'll do nothing dishonourable," said Ralph. "I'm very sure of that. Nothing can be more honourable than for him to leave the poor child alone. She cares for another person, and it's cruel to attempt to bribe her by magnificent offers to give him up." "Cruel to the other person, perhaps, the one she cares for. But Warburton isn't obliged to mind that." "No, cruel to her," said Isabel. "She would be very unhappy if she were to allow herself to be persuaded to desert poor Mr. Rozier. That idea seems to amuse you. Of course you're not in love with him. He has the merit, for Pansy, of being in love with Pansy. She can see at a glance that Lord Warburton isn't." "He'd be very good to her," said Ralph. "He has been good to her already. Fortunately, however, he has not said a word to disturb her. He could come and bid her good-bye to-morrow with perfect propriety." "How would your husband like that?" "Not at all, and he may be right in not liking it. Only he must obtain satisfaction himself." "Has he commissioned you to obtain it?" Ralph ventured to ask. "It was natural that, as an old friend of Lord Warburton's, an older friend, that is, than Gilbert, I should take an interest in his intentions." "Take an interest in his renouncing them, you mean?" Isabel hesitated, frowning a little. "Let me understand. Are you pleading his cause?" "Not in the least. I'm very glad he shouldn't become your stepdaughter's husband. It makes such a very queer relation to you," said Ralph, smiling. "But I'm rather nervous lest your husband should think you haven't pushed him enough." Isabel found herself able to smile as well as he. "He knows me well enough not to have expected me to push. He himself has no intention of pushing, I presume. I'm not afraid I shall not be able to justify myself," she said lightly. Her mask had dropped for an instant, but she had put it on again, to Ralph's infinite disappointment. He had caught a glimpse of her natural face, and he wished immensely to look into it. He had an almost savage desire to hear her complain of her husband, hear her say that she should be held accountable for Lord Warburton's defection. Ralph was certain that this was her situation. He knew by instinct, in advance, the form that in such an event Osmond's displeasure would take. It could only take the meanest and cruellest. He would have liked to warn Isabel of it, to let her see at least how he judged for her and how he knew. It little mattered that Isabel would know much better. It was for his own satisfaction more than for hers that he longed to show her he was not deceived. He tried and tried again to make her betray Osmond. He felt cold-blooded, cruel, dishonourable almost in doing so. But it scarcely mattered, for he only failed. What had she come for, then, and why did she seem almost to offer him a chance to violate their tacit convention? Why did she ask him his advice, if she gave him no liberty to answer her? How could they talk of her domestic embarrassments, as it pleased her humorously to designate them, if the principal factor was not to be mentioned? These contradictions were themselves but an indication of her trouble, and her cry for help just before was the only thing he was bound to consider. "You'll be decidedly at variance all the same," he said in a moment. And, as she answered nothing, looking as if she scarce understood, "You'll find yourselves thinking very differently," he continued. "That may easily happen among the most united couples." She took up her parasol. He saw she was nervous, afraid of what he might say. "It's a matter we can hardly quarrel about, however," she added, "for almost all the interest is on his side. That's very natural. Pansy's after all his daughter, not mine." And she put out her hand to wish him good-bye. Ralph took an inward resolution that she shouldn't leave him without his letting her know that he knew everything. It seemed too great an opportunity to lose. "Do you know what his interest will make him say?" he asked as he took her hand. She shook her head rather dryly, not discouragingly, and he went on. "It will make him say that your want of zeal is owing to jealousy." He stopped a moment. Her face made him afraid. "To jealousy?" "To jealousy of his daughter." She blushed red and threw back her head. "You're not kind," she said, in a voice that he had never heard on her lips. "Be frank with me, and you'll see," he answered. But she made no reply. She only pulled her hand out of his own, which he tried still to hold, and rapidly withdrew from the room. She made up her mind to speak to Pansy, and she took an occasion on the same day, going to the girl's room before dinner. Pansy was already dressed. She was always in advance of the time. It seemed to illustrate her pretty patience and the graceful stillness with which she could sit and wait. At present she was seated, in her fresh array, before the bedroom fire. She had blown out her candles on the completion of her toilet, in accordance with the economical habits in which she had been brought up, and which she was now more careful than ever to observe, so that the room was lighted only by a couple of logs. The rooms in Palazzo Roccanera were as spacious as they were numerous, and Pansy's virginal bower was an immense chamber with a dark, heavily timbered ceiling. Its diminutive mistress, in the midst of it, appeared but a speck of humanity, and as she got up with quick deference to welcome Isabel, the latter was more than ever struck with her shy sincerity. Isabel had a difficult task. The only thing was to perform it as simply as possible. She felt bitter and angry, but she warned herself against betraying this heat. She was afraid even of looking too grave, or at least too stern. She was afraid of causing alarm. But Pansy seemed to have guessed she had come more or less as a confessor, for after she had moved the chair in which she had been sitting a little nearer to the fire, and Isabel had taken her place in it, she kneeled down on a cushion in front of her, looking up and resting her clasped hands on her stepmother's knees. What Isabel wished to do was to hear from her own lips that her mind was not occupied with Lord Warburton, but if she desired the assurance, she felt herself by no means at liberty to provoke it. The girl's father would have qualified this as rank treachery, and indeed Isabel knew that if Pansy should display the smallest germ of a disposition to encourage Lord Warburton, her own duty was to hold her tongue. It was difficult to interrogate without appearing to suggest. Pansy's supreme simplicity, an innocence even more complete than Isabel had yet judged it, gave to the most tentative inquiry something of the effect of an admonition. As she knelt there in the vague firelight, with her pretty dress dimly shining, her hands folded half in appeal and half in submission, her soft eyes raised and fixed, full of the seriousness of the situation, she looked to Isabel like a childish martyr, decked out for sacrifice, and scarcely presuming even to hope to avert it. When Isabel said to her she had never yet spoken to her of what might have been going on in relation to her getting married, but that her silence had not been indifference or ignorance, had only been the desire to leave her at liberty, Pansy bent forward, raised her face nearer and nearer, and with a little murmur which evidently expressed a deep longing, answered that she had greatly wished her to speak, and that she begged her to advise her now. "It's difficult for me to advise you," Isabel returned. "I don't know how I can undertake that. That's for your father. You must get his advice, and above all you must act on it." At this Pansy dropped her eyes. For a moment she said nothing. "I think I should like your advice better than papa's," she presently remarked. "That's not as it should be," said Isabel coldly. "I love you very much, but your father loves you better." "It isn't because you love me, it's because you're a lady," Pansy answered, with the air of saying something very reasonable. "A lady can advise a young girl better than a man." "I advise you to pay the greatest respect to your father's wishes." "Ah, yes," said the child eagerly, "I must do that." "But if I speak to you now about your getting married, it's not for your own sake, it's for mine," Isabel went on. "If I try to learn from you what you expect, what you desire, it's only that I may act accordingly." Pansy stared, and then very quickly, "Will you do everything I want?" she asked. "Before I say yes, I must know what such things are." Pansy presently told her that the only thing she wanted in life was to marry Mr. Rozier. He had asked her, and she had told him she would do so if her papa would allow it. Now her papa wouldn't allow it. "Very well, then, it's impossible," Isabel pronounced. "Yes, it's impossible," said Pansy, without a sigh, and with the same extreme attention in her clear little face. "You must think of something else, then," Isabel went on. But Pansy, sighing at this, told her that she had attempted that feat without the least success. "You think of those who think of you," she said with a faint smile. "I know Mr. Rozier thinks of me." "He ought not to," said Isabel loftily. "Your father has expressly requested he shouldn't." "He can't help it, because he knows I think of him." "You shouldn't think of him. There's some excuse for him, perhaps, but there's none for you." "I wish you would try to find one," the girl exclaimed, as if she were praying to the Madonna. "I should be very sorry to attempt it," said the Madonna, with unusual frigidity. "If you knew some one else was thinking of you, would you think of him?" "No one can think of me as Mr. Rossiter does. No one has the right." "Ah, but I don't admit Mr. Rossiter's right," Isabel hypocritically cried. Pansy only gazed at her, evidently much puzzled, and Isabel, taking advantage of it, began to represent to her the wretched consequences of disobeying her father. At this Pansy stopped her with the assurance that she would never disobey him, would never marry without his consent, and she announced in the serenest, simplest tone that though she might never marry Mr. Rossiter, she would never cease to think of him. She appeared to have accepted the idea of eternal singleness. But Isabel, of course, was free to reflect that she had no conception of its meaning. She was perfectly sincere. She was prepared to give up her lover. This might seem an important step toward taking another, but for Pansy, evidently, it failed to lead in that direction. She felt no bitterness toward her father. There was no bitterness in her heart. There was only the sweetness of fidelity to Edward Rossiter, and a strange, exquisite intimation that she could prove it better by remaining single than even by marrying him. "Your father would like you to make a better marriage," said Isabel. "Mr. Rossiter's fortune is not at all large." "How do you mean better? If that would be good enough? And I have myself so little money. Why should I look for a fortune?" "Your having so little is a reason for looking for more." With which Isabel was grateful for the dimness of the room. She felt as if her face were hideously insincere. It was what she was doing for Osmond. It was what one had to do for Osmond. Pansy's solemn eyes, fixed on her own, almost embarrassed her. She was ashamed to think she had made so light of the girl's preference. "What should you like me to do?" her companion softly demanded. The question was a terrible one, and Isabel took refuge in timorous vagueness. "To remember all the pleasure it's in your power to give your father." "To marry some one else, you mean, if he should ask me?" For a moment Isabel's answer caused itself to be waited for. Then she heard herself utter it in the stillness that Pansy's attention seemed to make. "Yes, to marry some one else." The child's eyes grew more penetrating. Isabel believed she was doubting her sincerity, and the impression took force from her slowly getting up from her cushion. She stood there a moment with her small hands unclasped, and then quavered out, "Well, I hope no one will ask me." "There has been a question of that. Some one else would have been ready to ask you." "I don't think he can have been ready," said Pansy. "It would appear so, if he had been sure he'd succeed." "If he had been sure? Then he wasn't ready." Isabel thought this rather sharp. She also got up and stood a moment looking into the fire. "Lord Warburton has shown you great attention," she resumed. "Of course you know it's of him I speak." She found herself, against her expectation, almost placed in the position of justifying herself, which led her to introduce this nobleman more crudely than she had intended. "He has been very kind to me, and I like him very much. But if you mean that he'll propose for me, I think you're mistaken." "Perhaps I am, but your father would like it extremely." Pansy shook her head with a little wise smile. "Lord Warburton wouldn't propose simply to please papa." "Your father would like you to encourage him," Isabel went on mechanically. "How can I encourage him?" "I don't know. Your father must tell you that." Pansy said nothing for a moment. She only continued to smile, as if she were in possession of a bright assurance. "There's no danger, no danger," she declared at last. There was a conviction in the way she said this, and a felicity in her believing it, which conduced to Isabel's awkwardness. She felt accused of dishonesty, and the idea was disgusting. To repair her self-respect, she was on the point of saying that Lord Warburton had let her know that there was a danger. But she didn't. She only said, in her embarrassment rather wide of the mark, that he surely had been most kind, most friendly. "Yes, he has been very kind," Pansy answered. "That's what I like him for." "Why, then, is the difficulty so great?" "I've always felt sure of his knowing that I don't want—what did you say I should do? To encourage him. He knows I don't want to marry, and he wants me to know that he therefore won't trouble me. That's the meaning of his kindness. It's as if he said to me, 'I like you very much, but if it doesn't please you, I'll never say it again.' I think that's very kind, very noble," Pansy went on, with deepening positiveness. "That is all we've said to each other. And he doesn't care for me either. Ah, no, there's no danger." Isabel was touched with wonder at the depths of perception of which this submissive little person was capable. She felt afraid of Pansy's wisdom, began almost to retreat before it. "You must tell your father that," she remarked reservedly. "I think I'd rather not," Pansy unreservedly answered. "You oughtn't to let him have false hopes." "Perhaps not, but it will be good for me that he should. So long as he believes that Lord Warburton intends anything of the kind you say, Papa won't propose any one else. And that will be an advantage for me," said the child very lucidly. There was something brilliant in her lucidity, and it made her companion draw a long breath. It relieved this friend of a heavy responsibility. Pansy had a sufficient illumination of her own, and Isabel felt that she herself just now had no light to spare from her small stock. Nevertheless, it still clung to her that she must be loyal to Osmond, that she was on her honour in dealing with his daughter. Under the influence of this sentiment, she threw out another suggestion before she retired, a suggestion with which it seemed to her that she should have done her utmost. "Your father takes for granted, at least, that you would like to marry a nobleman." Pansy stood in the doorway. She had drawn back the curtain for Isabel to pass. "I think Mr. Rozier looks like one," she remarked very gravely. Chapter 46. Lord Warburton was not seen in Mrs. Osmond's drawing-room for several days, and Isabel couldn't fail to observe that her husband said nothing to her about having received a letter from him. She couldn't fail to observe either that Osmond was in a state of expectancy, and that though it was not agreeable to him to betray it, he thought their distinguished friend kept him waiting quite too long. At the end of 4 days he alluded to his absence. "What has become of Warburton? What does he mean by treating me like a tradesman with a bill?" "I know nothing about him," Isabel said. "I saw him last Friday at the German ball. He told me then that he meant to write to you." "He has never written to me." "So I supposed, from your not having told me." "He's an odd fish," said Osmond comprehensively; and on Isabel's making no rejoinder, he went on to inquire whether it took his lordship 5 days to indite a letter. "Does he form his words with such difficulty?" "I don't know," Isabel was reduced to replying. "I've never had a letter from him." "Never had a letter? I had an idea that you were at one time in intimate correspondence." She answered that this had not been the case, and let the conversation drop. On the morrow, however, coming into the drawing-room late in the afternoon, her husband took it up again. "When Lord Warburton told you of his intention of writing, what did you say to him?" he asked. She just faltered. "I think I told him not to forget it." "Did you believe that there was a danger of that?" "As you say, he's an odd fish." "Apparently he has forgotten it," said Osmond. "Be so good as to remind him." "Should you like me to write to him?" she demanded. "I've no objection whatever." "You expect too much of me." "Ah, yes, I expect a great deal of you." "I'm afraid I shall disappoint you," said Isabel. "My expectations have survived a good deal of disappointment." "Of course I know that. Think how I must have disappointed myself. If you really wish hands laid on Lord Warburton, you must lay them yourself." For a couple of minutes Osmond answered nothing. Then he said, "That won't be easy with you working against me." Isabel started. She felt herself beginning to tremble. He had a way of looking at her through half-closed eyelids, as if he were thinking of her but scarcely saw her, which seemed to her to have a wonderfully cruel intention. It appeared to recognize her as a disagreeable necessity of thought, but to ignore her for the time as a presence. That effect had never been so marked as now. "I think you accuse me of something very base," she returned. "I accuse you of not being trustworthy. If he doesn't after all come forward, it will be because you've kept him off. I don't know that it's base. It is the kind of thing a woman always thinks she may do. I've no doubt you have the finest ideas about it." "I told you I would do what I could," she went on. "Yes, that gained you time." It came over her, after he had said this, that she had once thought him beautiful. "How much you must want to make sure of him!" she exclaimed in a moment. She had no sooner spoken than she perceived the full reach of her words, of which she had not been conscious in uttering them. They made a comparison between Osmond and herself, recalled the fact that she had once held this coveted treasure in her hand and felt herself rich enough to let it fall. A momentary exultation took possession of her, a horrible delight in having wounded him, for his face instantly told her that none of the force of her exclamation was lost. He expressed nothing otherwise, however. He only said quickly, "Yes, I want it immensely." At this moment a servant came in to usher a visitor, and he was followed the next by Lord Warburton, who received a visible check on seeing Osmond. He looked rapidly from the master of the house to the mistress, a movement that seemed to denote a reluctance to interrupt or even a perception of ominous conditions. Then he advanced, with his English address, in which a vague shyness seemed to offer itself as an element of good breeding, in which the only defect was a difficulty in achieving transitions. Osmond was embarrassed. He found nothing to say, but Isabel remarked, promptly enough, that they had been in the act of talking about their visitor. Upon this her husband added that they hadn't known what was become of him. They had been afraid he had gone away. "No," he explained, smiling and looking at Osmond, "I'm only on the point of going." And then he mentioned that he had found himself suddenly recalled to England. He should start on the morrow or the day after. "I'm awfully sorry to leave poor Touchett," he ended by exclaiming. For a moment neither of his companions spoke. Osmond only leaned back in his chair listening. Isabel didn't look at him. She could only fancy how he looked. Her eyes were on their visitor's face, where they were the more free to rest that those of his lordship carefully avoided them. Yet Isabel was sure that had she met his glance she would have found it expressive. "You had better take poor Touchett with you," she heard her husband say, lightly enough, in a moment. "He had better wait for warmer weather," Lord Warburton answered. "I shouldn't advise him to travel just now." He sat there a quarter of an hour, talking as if he might not soon see them again, unless indeed they should come to England, a course he strongly recommended. Why shouldn't they come to England in the autumn? That struck him as a very happy thought. It would give him such pleasure to do what he could for them, to have them come and spend a month with him. Osmond, by his own admission, had been to England but once, which was an absurd state of things for a man of his leisure and intelligence. It was just the country for him. He would be sure to get on well there. Then Lord Warburton asked Isabel if she remembered what a good time she had had there, and if she didn't want to try it again. Didn't she want to see Gardencourt once more? Gardencourt was really very good. Touchett didn't take the proper care of it, but it was the sort of place you could hardly spoil by letting it alone. Why didn't they come and pay Touchett a visit? He surely must have asked them. Hadn't asked them? What an ill-mannered wretch! And Lord Warburton promised to give the master of Gardencourt a piece of his mind. Of course it was a mere accident. He would be delighted to have them. Spending a month with Touchett and a month with himself, and seeing all the rest of the people they must know there, they really wouldn't find it half bad. Lord Warburton added that it would amuse Miss Osmond as well, who had told him that she had never been to England, and whom he had assured it was a country she deserved to see. Of course she didn't need to go to England to be admired. That was her fate everywhere. But she would be an immense success there, she certainly would, if that was any inducement. He asked if she were not at home. Couldn't he say good-bye? Not that he liked good-byes. He always funked them. When he left England the other day he hadn't said good-bye to a two-legged creature. He had had half a mind to leave Rome without troubling Mrs. Osmond for a final interview. What could be more dreary than final interviews? One never said the things one wanted. One remembered them all an hour afterwards. On the other hand, one usually said a lot of things one shouldn't, simply from a sense that one had to say something. Such a sense was upsetting. It muddled one's wits. He had it at present, and that was the effect it produced on him. If Mrs. Osmond didn't think he spoke as he ought, she must set it down to agitation. It was no light thing to part with Mrs. Osmond. He was really very sorry to be going. He had thought of writing to her instead of calling, but he would write to her at any rate to tell her a lot of things that would be sure to occur to him as soon as he had left the house. They must think seriously about coming to Lotley. If there was anything awkward in the conditions of his visit, or in the announcement of his departure, it failed to come to the surface. Lord Warburton talked about his agitation, but he showed it in no other manner, and Isabel saw that since he had determined on a retreat, he was capable of executing it gallantly. She was very glad for him. She liked him quite well enough to wish him to appear to carry a thing off. He would do that on any occasion, not from impudence, but simply from the habit of success. And Isabel felt it out of her husband's power to frustrate this faculty. A complex operation, as she sat there, went on in her mind. On one side she listened to their visitor, said what was proper to him, read more or less between the lines of what he said himself, and wondered how he would have spoken if he had found her alone. On the other, she had a perfect consciousness of Osmond's emotion. She felt almost sorry for him. He was condemned to the sharp pain of loss without the relief of cursing. He had had a great hope, and now, as he saw it vanish into smoke, he was obliged to sit and smile and twirl his thumbs. Not that he troubled himself to smile very brightly. He treated their friend on the whole to as vacant a countenance as so clever a man could very well wear. It was indeed a part of Osmond's cleverness that he could look consummately uncompromised. His present appearance, however, was not a confession of disappointment. It was simply a part of Osmond's habitual system, which was to be inexpressive exactly in proportion as he was really intent. He had been intent on this prize from the first, but he had never allowed his eagerness to irradiate his refined face. He had treated his possible son-in-law as he treated every one, with an air of being interested in him only for his own advantage, not for any profit to a person already so generally, so perfectly provided as Gilbert Osmond. He would give no sign now of an inward rage, which was the result of any vanished prospect of gain, not the faintest nor the subtlest. Isabel could be sure of that, if it was any satisfaction to her. Strangely, very strangely, it was a satisfaction. She wished Lord Warburton to triumph before her husband, and at the same time she wished her husband to be very superior before Lord Warburton. Osmond, in his way, was admirable. He had, like their visitor, the advantage of an acquired habit. It was not that of succeeding, but it was something almost as good, that of not attempting. As he leaned back in his place, listening but vaguely to the other's friendly offers and suppressed explanations, as if it were only proper to assume that they were addressed essentially to his wife, he had at least, since so little else was left him, the comfort of thinking how well he personally had kept out of it, and how the air of indifference, which he was now able to wear, had the added beauty of consistency. It was something to be able to look as if the leave-taker's movements had no relation to his own mind. The latter did well, certainly, but Osmond's performance was, in its very nature, more finished. Lord Warburton's position was, after all, an easy one. There was no reason in the world why he shouldn't leave Rome. He had had beneficent inclinations, but they had stopped short of fruition. He had never committed himself, and his honour was safe. Osmond appeared to take but a moderate interest in the proposal that they should go and stay with him, and in his allusions to the success Pansy might extract from their visit. He murmured a recognition, but left Isabel to say that it was a matter requiring grave consideration. Isabel, even while she made this remark, could see the great vista which had suddenly opened out in her husband's mind, with Pansy's little figure marching up the middle of it. Lord Warburton had asked leave to bid good-bye to Pansy, but neither Isabel nor Osmond had made any motion to send for her. He had the air of giving out that his visit must be short. He sat on a small chair, as if it were only for a moment, keeping his hat in his hand. But he stayed and stayed. Isabel wondered what he was waiting for. She believed it was not to see Pansy. She had an impression that on the whole he would rather not see Pansy. It was, of course, to see herself alone. He had something to say to her. Isabel had no great wish to hear it, for she was afraid it would be an explanation, and she could perfectly well dispense with explanations. Osmond, however, presently got up, like a man of good taste, to whom it had occurred that so inveterate a visitor might wish to say just the last word of all to the ladies. "I've a letter to write before dinner," he said. "You must excuse me. I'll see if my daughter's disengaged, and if she is, she shall know you're here. Of course, when you come to Rome, you'll always look us up. Mrs. Osmond will talk to you about the English expedition. She decides all those things." The nod with which, instead of a handshake, he wound up this little speech was perhaps rather a meagre form of salutation, but on the whole it was all the occasion demanded. Isabel reflected that after he left the room Lord Warburton would have no pretext for saying, "Your husband's very angry," which would have been extremely disagreeable to her. Nevertheless, if he had done so, she would have said, "Oh, don't be anxious. He doesn't hate you. It's me that he hates." It was only when they had been left alone together that her friend showed a certain vague awkwardness, sitting down in another chair, handling 2 or 3 of the objects that were near him. "I hope he'll make Miss Osmond come," he presently remarked. "I want very much to see her." "I'm glad it's the last time," said Isabel. "So am I. She doesn't care for me." "No, she doesn't care for you." "I don't wonder at it," he returned. Then he added with inconsequence, "You'll come to England, won't you?" "I think we had better not." "Ah, you owe me a visit. Don't you remember that you were to have come to Lockley once, and you never did?" "Everything's changed since then," said Isabel. "Not changed for the worse, surely, as far as we're concerned. To see you under my roof," and he hung fire but an instant, "would be a great satisfaction." She had feared an explanation, but that was the only one that occurred. They talked a little of Ralph, and in another moment Pansy came in, already dressed for dinner, and with a little red spot in either cheek. She shook hands with Lord Warburton, and stood looking up into his face with a fixed smile, a smile that Isabel knew, though his lordship probably never suspected it, to be near akin to a burst of tears. "I'm going away," he said. "I want to bid you good-bye." "Good-bye, Lord Warburton." Her voice perceptibly trembled. "And I want to tell you how much I wish you may be very happy." "Thank you, Lord Warburton," Pansy answered. He lingered a moment and gave a glance at Isabel. "You ought to be very happy. You've got a guardian angel." "I'm sure I shall be happy," said Pansy, in the tone of a person whose certainties were always cheerful. "Such a conviction as that will take you a great way. But if it should ever fail you, remember," and her interlocutor stammered a little. "Think of me sometimes, you know," he said with a vague laugh. Then he shook hands with Isabel in silence, and presently he was gone. When he had left the room she expected an effusion of tears from her stepdaughter, but Pansy in fact treated her to something very different. "I think you are my guardian angel," she exclaimed very sweetly. Isabel shook her head. "I'm not an angel of any kind. I'm at the most your good friend." "You're a very good friend, then, to have asked papa to be gentle with me?" "I've asked your father nothing," said Isabel, wondering. "He told me just now to come to the drawing-room, and then he gave me a very kind kiss." "Ah," said Isabel, "that was quite his own idea." She recognized the idea perfectly. It was very characteristic, and she was to see a great deal more of it. Even with Pansy he couldn't put himself the least in the wrong. They were dining out that day, and after their dinner they went to another entertainment, so that it was not till late in the evening that Isabel saw him alone. When Pansy kissed him before going to bed, he returned her embrace with even more than his usual munificence, and Isabel wondered if he meant it as a hint that his daughter had been injured by the machinations of her stepmother. It was a partial expression, at any rate, of what he continued to expect of his wife. She was about to follow Pansy, but he remarked that he wished she would remain. He had something to say to her. Then he walked about the drawing-room a little, while she stood waiting in her cloak. "I don't understand what you wish to do," he said in a moment. "I should like to know, so that I may know how to act." "Just now I wish to go to bed. I'm very tired." "Sit down and rest. I shall not keep you long. Not there. Take a comfortable place." And he arranged a multitude of cushions that were scattered in picturesque disorder upon a vast divan. This was not, however, where she seated herself. She dropped into the nearest chair. The fire had gone out. The lights in the great room were few. She drew her cloak about her. She felt mortally cold. "I think you're trying to humiliate me," Osmond went on. "It's a most absurd undertaking." "I haven't the least idea what you mean," she returned. "You've played a very deep game. You've managed it beautifully." "What is it that I've managed?" "You've not quite settled it? However, we shall see him again." And he stopped in front of her, with his hands in his pockets, looking down at her thoughtfully in his usual way, which seemed meant to let her know that she was not an object, but only a rather disagreeable incident of thought. "If you mean that Lord Warburton's under an obligation to come back, you're wrong," Isabel said. "He's under none whatever." "That's just what I complain of. But when I say he'll come back, I don't mean he'll come back from a sense of duty." "There's nothing else to make him. I think he has quite exhausted Rome." "Ah, no, that's a shallow judgment. Rome's inexhaustible." And Osmond began to walk about again. "However, about that perhaps there's no hurry," he added. "It's rather a good idea of his that we should go to England. If it were not for the fear of finding your cousin there, I think I should try to persuade you." "It may be that you'll not find my cousin," said Isabel. "I should like to be sure of it. However, I shall be as sure as possible. At the same time I should like to see his house, that you told me so much about at one time. What do you call it? Garden Court. It must be a charming thing. And then, you know, I've a devotion to the memory of your uncle. You made me take a great fancy to him. I should like to see where he lived and died. That indeed is a detail. Your friend was right. Pansy ought to see England." "I've no doubt she would enjoy it," said Isabel. "But that's a long time hence. Next autumn's far off," Osmond continued. "And meantime there are things that more nearly interest us." "Do you think me so very proud?" he suddenly asked. "I think you very strange." "You don't understand me." "No, not even when you insult me." "I don't insult you. I'm incapable of it. I merely speak of certain facts, and if the allusion's an injury to you, the fault's not mine. It's surely a fact that you have kept all this matter quite in your own hands." "Are you going back to Lord Warburton?" Isabel asked. "I'm very tired of his name." "You shall hear it again before we've done with it." She had spoken of his insulting her, but it suddenly seemed to her that this ceased to be a pain. He was going down, down. The vision of such a fall made her almost giddy. That was the only pain. He was too strange, too different. He didn't touch her. Still, the working of his morbid passion was extraordinary, and she felt a rising curiosity to know in what light he saw himself justified. "I might say to you that I judge you've nothing to say to me that's worth hearing," she returned in a moment. "But I should perhaps be wrong. There's a thing that would be worth my hearing, to know in the plainest words of what it is you accuse me." "Of having prevented Pansy's marriage to Warburton. Are those words plain enough?" "On the contrary, I took a great interest in it. I told you so, and when you told me that you counted on me, that I think was what you said, I accepted the obligation. I was a fool to do so, but I did it." "You pretended to do it, and you even pretended reluctance to make me more willing to trust you. Then you began to use your ingenuity to get him out of the way." "I think I see what you mean," said Isabel. "Where's the letter you told me he had written me?" her husband demanded. "I haven't the least idea. I haven't asked him." "You've stopped it on the way," said Osmond. Isabel slowly got up. Standing there in her white cloak, which covered her to her feet, she might have represented the angel of disdain, first cousin to that of pity. "Oh, Gilbert, for a man who was so fine!" she exclaimed in a long murmur. "I was never so fine as you. You've done everything you wanted. You've got him out of the way without appearing to do so, and you've placed me in the position in which you wish to see me, that of a man who has tried to marry his daughter to a lord, but has grotesquely failed." "Pansy doesn't care for him. She's very glad he's gone," Isabel said. "That has nothing to do with the matter." "And he doesn't care for Pansy." "That won't do. You told me he did. I don't know why you wanted this particular satisfaction," Osmond continued. "You might have taken some other. It doesn't seem to me that I've been presumptuous, that I have taken too much for granted. I've been very modest about it, very quiet. The idea didn't originate with me. He began to show that he liked her before I ever thought of it. I left it all to you." "Yes, you were very glad to leave it to me. After this you must attend to such things yourself." He looked at her a moment, then he turned away. "I thought you were very fond of my daughter." "I've never been more so than to-day." "Your affection is attended with immense limitations. However, that perhaps is natural." "Is this all you wish to say to me?" Isabel asked, taking a candle that stood on one of the tables. "Are you satisfied? Am I sufficiently disappointed?" "I don't think that on the whole you're disappointed. You've had another opportunity to try to stupefy me." "It's not that. It's proved that Pansy can aim high." "Poor little Pansy," said Isabel, as she turned away with her candle. Chapter 46